There is an island in the middle of an ornamental lake on an estate in Northamptonshire where the grass is always kept short and the flowers are always fresh. No bridge connects the island to the shore. No boat is permanently moored at the water's edge. The only way to reach it is to be rowed across by a member of the estate staff, and they will only do this for a small number of people whose names appear on a list that has never been made public. On the island, beneath a marble slab, inscribed with her name and the dates of her life, lies Diana, Princess of Wales. She was buried here on September 6, 1997, after a funeral that was watched by 2.5 billion people worldwide, making it the most viewed event in the history of television. The decision to bury her at Althorp rather than in the Spencer family vault at the Church of St Mary the Virgin in Great Brington was made by her brother, Charles Spencer, the 9th Earl. He said he wanted her to rest in peace, away from the public gaze that had defined and ultimately consumed her life. But there was another reason, a reason that spoke to centuries of rivalry between the Spencers and the Crown. He wanted Diana to come home, not to the Windsors, not to the monarchy. Home to Althorp, home to the family that had held this land since before Henry VIII sat on the throne. The island burial was a break from 500 years of Spencer family tradition. It was also an act of defiance against the institution that the Spencers believed had destroyed their most famous daughter. And it raised a question that has haunted this estate since its earliest days. What is it about Althorp that produces such beauty, such ambition, such extraordinary public lives, and then consumes them all in private tragedy? This is the dark story of Britain's most tragic estate. The story begins in 1508 in the wool markets of the English Midlands. John Spencer was not a nobleman. He was a sheep farmer, but he was a sheep farmer on a scale that would be extraordinary even today. The Spencer family owned tens of thousands of sheep grazing across Warwickshire and Northamptonshire, producing wool that was sold to cloth merchants in London and exported to the textile markets of Flanders. By the beginning of the 16th century, the Spencers were one of the wealthiest families in England, wealthier than most of the ancient noble houses who had held their lands since the Norman conquest. John Spencer used that wealth to purchase Althorp and its surrounding estate in 1508. The property included a moated medieval manor house, several hundred acres of parkland, and tenant farms that provided a steady rental income. The purchase was a declaration of intent. The Spencers were no longer content to be merchants. They wanted to be gentry. They wanted land, a great house, and the social status that came with both. The original house was built of red brick in the Tudor style, with tall chimneys, mullioned windows, and a great hall that served as the centre of household life. It was surrounded by a moat, fed by natural springs, and approached through a gatehouse that announced the family's arrival in the landowning class. The house was comfortable, but modest by the standards of the great aristocratic families. The Spencers had money. What they lacked was time. The Howards, the Percys, the Talbots had held their estates for centuries. The Spencers had held theirs for months. In Tudor England, that distinction mattered enormously, but the Spencers understood something that many older families did not. Money could buy time, or at least it could buy the appearance of time. Over the following decades, the family invested relentlessly in the house, the estate, and the relationships that would elevate them from wealthy farmers to members of the ruling class. Robert Spencer, John's great-grandson, was the architect of the family's transformation. Created first Baron Spencer by King James I in 1603, Robert poured money into Althorp on a scale that astonished his contemporaries. He rebuilt the Great Hall, added a long gallery in the fashionable Elizabethan style, and filled the house with tapestries, paintings, and furniture imported from Italy and France. When James I visited Althorp in 1603, the entertainment was so lavish that it reportedly cost more than the annual income of most English peers. Robert Spencer understood that hospitality was a form of political investment. Every pound spent on entertaining the king was a pound invested in the family's future. The investment paid off. The Spencers rose steadily through the ranks of the English aristocracy, accumulating titles, offices, and influence with each generation. But the price of that rise was paid in blood. Henry Spencer, Robert's son, was killed at the First Battle of Newbury on September 20th, 1643. He was 23 years old and had been married for less than 2 years. He fought for King Charles I against the parliamentary forces of the Earl of Essex in one of the most bitterly contested engagements of the English Civil War. The battle lasted an entire day, over 3,500 men were killed. Henry was struck by a musket ball while leading a cavalry charge and died on the field. His death left the family estates in the hands of his infant son, and Althorp itself became a casualty of the war. Parliamentary forces occupied the house and used it as a military headquarters. Soldiers were billeted in the state rooms. Horses were stabled in the Great Hall. Furniture was broken up for firewood. Paintings were damaged. The moat, which had served as a defensive feature for over a century, was partially filled in. By the time the war ended, Althorp had been systematically degraded from a showpiece of aristocratic taste into a military barracks. The Spencers rebuilt. They always rebuilt. That was their particular talent and their particular curse. Henry's son, Robert, the second Earl of Sunderland, not only restored Althorp, but transformed it into one of the most important political houses in Restoration England. He served as Secretary of State under Charles II and James II, navigating the treacherous politics of the late Stuart period with a combination of intelligence, ambition, and moral flexibility that his enemies described as outright treachery. He changed his political allegiance 3 times, his religion twice, and his loyalties whenever circumstances demanded. He died at Althorp in 1702, having survived every political crisis of the previous 40 years, while most of his contemporaries were imprisoned, exiled, or executed. The 18th century brought Althorp its most dramatic physical transformation. The first Earl Spencer, created in 1765, commissioned the architect Henry Holland to completely remodel the house between 1787 and 1791. Holland encased the original Tudor brick in the pale grey mathematical tiles that give the house its current appearance. The red brick Tudor manor vanished beneath a classical facade that made Althorp look as though it had been designed by Palladio rather than built by a sheep farmer. The interior was rebuilt around a magnificent entrance hall with a double staircase, and the staterooms were decorated in the neoclassical style with painted ceilings, marble fireplaces, and plasterwork of extraordinary refinement. The remodeling was more than cosmetic. It was an act of historical erasure. The Spencers were no longer content to live in a house that revealed their origins as Tudor merchants. They wanted a house that proclaimed their status as one of the great families of Georgian England. The facade of classical elegance concealed the commercial foundations beneath it. Just as the family's carefully maintained genealogy emphasized their aristocratic connections while quietly overlooking the sheep. The first Earl also began assembling the art collection that would make Althorp one of the most important houses in Europe. He purchased works by Van Dyck, Rubens, Reynolds, and Gainsborough, creating a collection that rivaled those of the royal palaces. The picture gallery at Althorp, a long room on the first floor lit by tall windows overlooking the park, became one of the most celebrated private galleries in England. Visitors were admitted by appointment, and the collection was catalogued and published in a series of volumes that established the Spencers' reputation as connoisseurs of the highest order. The second Earl Spencer added the library. Over 3 decades, he assembled a collection of over 100,000 printed books and manuscripts that was widely regarded as the finest private library in Europe. It included 58 volumes printed by William Caxton, the first English printer, more than any other collection in the world. First editions of Shakespeare, Milton, and Chaucer, illuminated medieval manuscripts, scientific texts, maps, atlases. The library occupied several rooms at Althorp and required a full-time librarian to maintain it. The library was the second Earl's monument to his family's intellectual ambitions. It said that the Spencers were not merely rich, they were cultivated, they were serious. They belonged at the highest table of English civilization. The irony is that the library would eventually become the family's greatest loss. The fourth Earl Spencer married Adelaide Seymour in 1854. Their marriage was described by contemporaries as deeply unhappy. Adelaide suffered from severe depression that worsened over the years, and she spent long periods confined to her rooms at Althorp, attended by nurses and rarely seen by visitors. The exact nature of her illness was never publicly discussed. In the language of the Victorian aristocracy, she was described as delicate and nervous. She died in 1877. The cause of death was recorded as general debility, a term so vague as to be meaningless. The fourth Earl retreated into the library after Adelaide's death. It became his refuge, his purpose, and ultimately the thing he cared about most in the world. When death duties and declining agricultural income forced him to consider selling parts of the collection, the decision nearly destroyed him. In 1892, the entire library was sold to Enriqueta Rylands, the widow of a Manchester textile magnate, for £210,000. She donated it to the John Rylands Library in Manchester, where it remains today. The sale was described as the greatest single acquisition in British library history. For the fourth Earl, it was the greatest single loss. He died 2 years later. Those who knew him said he never recovered from the departure of his books. He had spent decades in their company. Without them, the rooms where they had stood were just empty shelves. The fifth Earl Spencer, known as the Red Earl for his magnificent beard, inherited a house with empty bookshelves and a family reputation that needed rebuilding. He threw himself into politics, serving as Lord Lieutenant of Ireland twice during one of the most violent periods in Anglo-Irish history. His first term coincided with the Land War, a period of intense agrarian agitation. His second term began with the Phoenix Park murders of 1882, when Lord Frederick Cavendish, the Chief Secretary for Ireland, and Thomas Henry Burke were stabbed to death by members of the Irish National Invincibles in Dublin's Phoenix Park, less than a day after their appointment. The Red Earl's response was a combination of coercion and reform that satisfied neither the Irish nationalists nor the British hardliners. He introduced a Crimes Act that gave police sweeping powers of arrest, while simultaneously supporting land reform legislation that transferred ownership from landlords to tenants. The dual approach exhausted him politically and personally. He spent his final years at Althorp, walking the grounds alone, a man who had tried to govern an ungovernable situation and been worn down by the impossibility of it. He died in 1910. The sixth Earl inherited Althorp and immediately confronted the financial reality that had been building for decades. Death duties, introduced in 1894, hit landed estates with devastating force. Each time an earl died and a new earl inherited, the government took a substantial percentage of the estate's value in tax. The sixth Earl began selling paintings to pay the bills. A Van Dyck went to an American collector, a Reynolds went to auction, a Gainsborough left for a museum in Washington. Each sale diminished the collection that 5 generations had assembled. Each sale felt like a betrayal of the ancestors who had acquired these works, and each sale was necessary for survival. The pattern continued under the 7th Earl, Albert Edward John Spencer, known as Jack. He married Cynthia Hamilton in 1919 and devoted himself to managing the estate through the Depression, the Second World War, and the austerity of the post-war years. Althorp, like every great English country house, struggled to justify its existence in an age of declining aristocratic wealth and rising democratic expectations. The house consumed money. The farms generated less and less. The staff could not be maintained at pre-war levels. Jack Spencer kept the estate afloat through a combination of careful management, judicious sales, and the stubborn refusal to admit that the world his family had built was disappearing. He died in 1975. His son, Edward John Spencer, known as Johnny, inherited Althorp, and Johnny Spencer's story is where the tragedy of this estate becomes inseparable from the most famous woman of the 20th century. Johnny Spencer married Frances Roche on June 1st, 1954 at Westminster Abbey. It was, by the standards of the day, a brilliant match. Frances was the daughter of the 4th Baron Fermoy and Ruth Gill, a close friend and lady-in-waiting to Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. The wedding was attended by the Queen and members of the royal family. Frances was 18. Johnny was 30. The marriage began with expectation and ended in devastation. The Spencers desperately wanted a male heir. Their first child, Sarah, was born in 1955. Their second, Jane, in 1957. Their third, a son named John, was born on January 12, 1960. He lived for 10 hours. The death of baby John devastated both parents, but it also created a pressure that would poison the marriage from that point forward. Frances was expected to produce a healthy male heir. When their next child was a girl, born on July 1st, 1961, the disappointment was palpable. That girl was Diana Frances Spencer. Her birth was not celebrated. No church bells were rung. No announcement was placed in the Times for several days. She arrived into a family that wanted a boy. A son, Charles, was finally born on May 20th, 1964. The heir was secured, but the marriage was beyond repair. Frances Spencer left the family in 1967. She moved to London with Peter Shankid, a wallpaper heir she had met at a dinner party. The subsequent divorce proceedings were savage. Custody of the 4 children was contested fiercely, and in a twist that would scar Diana for life, Frances's own mother, Ruth Lady Fermoy, testified against her daughter in court, supporting Johnny's claim for custody. The children were awarded to their father. Diana was 6 years old when her mother left, and then Rain arrived. In 1976, Johnny Spencer began a relationship with Rain, Countess of Dartmouth. She was the daughter of Barbara Cartland, the romance novelist who had sold over 700 million books worldwide. Rain was glamorous, forceful, and possessed of a social confidence that overwhelmed everyone around her. She moved into Althorp and married Johnny in 1977 in a ceremony so quiet that none of his 4 children were told it was happening until after the fact. The children despised her. Diana nicknamed her Acid Rain. Sarah, the eldest, was openly hostile. The relationship between stepmother and stepchildren became one of the most toxic domestic situations in the English aristocracy, played out against the backdrop of a house large enough that entire wings could be used to avoid each other. Rain set about redecorating Althorp with an energy that the Spencer children experienced as an assault on their mother's memory. She replaced curtains, moved paintings, rearranged furniture that had stood in the same positions for generations. More controversially, she began selling items from the house to fund the renovations. Paintings, furniture, wine from the cellars, and other contents were sold through dealers without consulting the children, or, in some cases, without informing the trustees of the family estate. The sales generated intense resentment. Sarah Spencer reportedly pushed Rain down the main staircase at Althorp during a family argument, an incident that was never reported to the police but was witnessed by several members of staff. Then, in September 1978, Johnny Spencer collapsed with a massive cerebral hemorrhage. He was taken to hospital and given a 10% chance of survival. For weeks, he lay in a coma while his children and his wife maintained an uneasy vigil. The doctors recommended withdrawing treatment. Rain refused. She sat at his bedside day and night. She sourced an experimental drug called aslacillin from Germany that was not yet approved in the United Kingdom and persuaded the hospital to administer it. Against all medical expectations, Johnny recovered. He was never the same. His speech was affected. His movement was limited. His personality, according to those who knew him, was permanently altered. But he was alive. And the woman his children hated was the reason. The paradox of Rain Spencer haunted the family. She had saved their father's life while simultaneously, in their view, dismantling their family home. When Johnny died in 1992, Rain was asked to leave Althorp. She departed within hours, taking her personal possessions in a van. Charles Spencer, who inherited the estate, reportedly changed the locks the same day. Diana was 6 years old when her mother left. She later described hearing the crunch of gravel as her mother's car drove away from the house. She said she sat on the cold stone steps at Althorp and listened until the sound disappeared completely. That memory, she said, never left her. It shaped everything that followed: her need for love, her fear of abandonment, her desperate desire to be wanted. All of it began on those steps. Diana grew up between Althorp and Park House on the Sandringham estate, a property leased by the Spencers from the Crown. But it was Althorp that shaped her. The house was imposing and grand, filled with paintings and history and empty rooms that echoed when a child ran through them. Her bedroom was on the first floor in the nursery wing overlooking the park. It was a modest room by the standards of the house, with floral wallpaper and a single window that looked out over the oak trees and the lake where she would eventually be buried. She could see the island from her window, though as a child it held no particular significance. It was just a patch of grass in the middle of the water where the ducks nested in spring. The children had the run of the house. At least in theory, they played hide and seek in the 115-foot-long picture gallery, where Van Dycks and Reynoldses hung on walls that had not been redecorated since the 18th century. They raced through the painted hall, sliding on the black and white marble floor beneath ceiling murals depicting the triumph of classical virtues over vices. They were forbidden from entering the staterooms except on special occasions, which meant that much of the house existed as a series of closed doors and locked rooms that contained treasures they were not allowed to touch. Diana later described the house as beautiful, but cold. Not the temperature, the atmosphere. It was a house where feelings were not discussed, where sadness was endured privately, where children were expected to behave and not ask questions about why their mother had gone. The staff were kind but professional. The nannies changed frequently. The emotional constants in Diana's early life were her brother Charles, who was 3 years younger and her closest companion, and the house itself, which was always there, always the same, its rooms and corridors as familiar as her own reflection. She attended Riddlesworth Hall and then West Heath, boarding schools where she was an unremarkable student, but a gifted swimmer and dancer. She dreamed of becoming a ballet dancer but grew too tall. She left school at 16 without passing a single O-level and moved to London, where she shared a flat in Coleherne Court with 3 friends, worked as a nursery school teaching assistant, and cleaned houses for her older sister Sarah's friends. She was, by all accounts, a sweet, shy, somewhat naive young woman, with no particular ambition beyond finding someone to love who would love her back. The someone arrived in the summer of 1980. Prince Charles, 31 years old, and under relentless pressure from his family and the press to marry, was introduced to Diana at a country weekend. She was 19. She was aristocratic, photogenic, apparently compliant, and critically, she had no romantic history that could embarrass the crown. The courtship was brief. They met approximately 13 times before the engagement was announced on February the 24th, 1981. A television interviewer asked them if they were in love. Diana said, of course. Charles said, whatever in love means. He later explained that he was being philosophical. Diana later said that the answer killed something inside her before the marriage had even begun. The wedding, on July 29th, 1981, at St. Paul's Cathedral, was the greatest media spectacle of the 20th century. 750 million people watched the ceremony on television. Diana's ivory silk taffeta dress, designed by David and Elizabeth Emanuel, featured a 25-foot train that filled the aisle of St. Paul's. The glass coach procession through London drew over 1 million spectators. The balcony kiss at Buckingham Palace was photographed from every conceivable angle and reproduced on every front page in the world. The fairy tale lasted less than a year. Charles's relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles, which had begun in 1970 and had never fully ended, resumed almost immediately after the honeymoon. Diana discovered evidence of the relationship, including a bracelet Charles had commissioned for Camilla with the initials GF, standing for Girl Friday, their private nickname. Diana later said she felt sick when she found it. She was 20 years old, pregnant with her first child, and already competing with another woman for her husband's attention. The years that followed were a private catastrophe concealed behind a public spectacle. Diana suffered from bulimia nervosa, a condition she later described in detail on national television. She engaged in self-harm, cutting her arms and legs. She threw herself down a staircase at Sandringham while 4 months pregnant with Prince William, an incident witnessed by members of staff but never reported to the press. She made multiple suicide attempts that the palace dismissed as attention-seeking behavior. What the public saw was entirely different. They saw the most glamorous woman in the world. They saw her at hospital bedsides, holding the hands of AIDS patients when the disease was still surrounded by ignorance and stigma. They saw her carrying her sons on her hips like any normal mother. They saw her dancing with John Travolta at the White House in a midnight blue velvet dress that became one of the most photographed garments of the century. Diana's popularity created a problem the palace had never faced before. She was more famous than the institution she had married into, more popular than the Queen, more photographed than any human being who had ever lived, and she was unpredictable. She gave unauthorized interviews. She leaked information to journalists. She cultivated relationships with reporters who would publish sympathetic accounts of her side of the marriage. The palace establishment viewed her as a threat. She was rewriting the rules of a game that had been played the same way for centuries. In November 1995, Diana gave an interview to Martin Bashir for the BBC's Panorama programme that detonated like a bomb in the heart of the British establishment. Speaking directly to camera in Kensington Palace, she described her battle with bulimia. She described her self-harm. She described her husband's infidelity, and she delivered the line that would define the entire marriage in the public imagination. There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. 23 million people watched the broadcast. It was the most viewed interview in British television history. The interview destroyed what remained of the relationship between Diana and the palace establishment. The Queen wrote to both Charles and Diana recommending an early divorce. But the interview itself contained a poison that would not be discovered for 25 years. In 2021, an independent investigation by Lord Dyson concluded that Martin Bashir had used forged bank statements to gain Diana's trust. He had shown her fabricated documents suggesting that members of her own staff were being paid by the security services to spy on her. The forgeries played on Diana's existing paranoia and fears, manipulating her into giving an interview that she might otherwise have refused. The BBC knew about the forgeries within months of the broadcast and covered them up. A 1996 internal investigation was described by Lord Dyson as woefully ineffective. The forged documents were not examined. Bashir was not disciplined. Instead, he was promoted. He rose to become the BBC's religion editor. The corporation's reputation for integrity, built over nearly a century, was compromised to protect a single interview. Diana had been manipulated by another institution she had trusted. It was, in its way, the most fitting metaphor for her entire life. Every institution she encountered, the Crown, the Church, the media, used her, and then attempted to bury the truth about how they had done it. The separation was announced on December 9th, 1992, by Prime Minister John Major in the House of Commons. The divorce was finalised on August 28th, 1996. Diana received a settlement of approximately £17 million, continued to live at Kensington Palace, but lost her HRH title, a loss she described as painful not for herself, but for her sons, who would grow up with a mother who was no longer technically royal. Free of the marriage, Diana reinvented herself as a humanitarian campaigner. Her visit to an active minefield in Angola in January 1997, wearing body armour and a protective visor, generated headlines worldwide and gave momentum to the international campaign to ban landmines. The Ottawa Treaty, banning anti-personnel mines, was signed by 122 nations in December 1997, 3 months after her death. Many observers credited Diana's advocacy as a decisive factor. She had achieved more in 2 years of independence than in 15 years of marriage. On the evening of August 30th, 1997, Diana and Dodi Fayed, the son of Egyptian billionaire Mohammed Al Fayed, dined at the Ritz Hotel in Paris. They had been seeing each other for 6 weeks. The relationship had generated a frenzy of media coverage. Paparazzi photographers staked out the hotel entrance, their cameras trained on the revolving doors, waiting for the shot that could earn them £250,000. At approximately 12:20 a.m., Diana and Dodi left the Ritz through a rear exit, hoping to avoid the photographers. Their driver was Henri Paul, the hotel's deputy head of security. Paul had been off duty earlier that evening and had been drinking. His blood alcohol level, established later by toxicology, was more than 3 times the French legal limit. He was also taking prescription antidepressants that interacted dangerously with alcohol. Neither Diana nor Dodi knew any of this. They trusted the Ritz to provide a competent driver. The Ritz provided Henri Paul. The black Mercedes S280 pulled away from the rear of the hotel and turned onto the Rue Cambon. Within seconds, paparazzi on motorcycles picked up the pursuit. Paul accelerated. The Mercedes headed west along the right bank of the Seine, traveling at speeds that witnesses later estimated at over 100 miles per hour through city streets designed for 30. At 12:23 a.m., the Mercedes entered the Pont de l'Alma tunnel, an underpass that descends sharply beneath the Place de l'Alma. The road surface was dry. The tunnel was well lit. There was no mechanical failure. Henri Paul lost control of the vehicle. Some investigators believe he clipped a white Fiat Uno that was never conclusively identified. The Mercedes swerved left, crossed the oncoming lane, and struck the 13th concrete pillar of the tunnel at an estimated speed of 65 miles per hour. The impact was catastrophic. The front of the car collapsed. The engine was driven backward into the passenger compartment. Henri Paul and Dodi Fayed were killed instantly. Trevor Rees-Jones. Diana's bodyguard, who was sitting in the front passenger seat and was the only occupant wearing a seatbelt, survived with devastating facial injuries that required years of reconstructive surgery. He has never fully recovered his memory of the crash. Diana was in the back seat behind the driver. She was conscious when the first emergency responders reached the vehicle. She spoke. She asked what had happened. The Paris Fire Brigade's emergency medical team, which in France provides advanced medical care at accident scenes, worked on her in the wreckage for over an hour before she could be extracted. She had suffered massive internal injuries, including a torn pulmonary vein. She was transferred to the Pitié-Salpêtrière hospital by ambulance, a journey of less than 4 miles that took over 40 minutes, because the ambulance stopped at least once to administer treatment en route. At the hospital, a team of surgeons opened her chest and attempted to repair the damage to her heart and lungs. The surgery lasted approximately 2 hours. At 4 a.m. local time, the doctors informed the British ambassador that Diana, Princess of Wales, was dead. She was 36 years old. The news reached Althorp in the early hours of Sunday morning. Charles Spencer was woken by a telephone call from his sister Jane, who had been informed by the British Embassy in Paris. Spencer later said that his first thought was that the press had finally killed her. It was a feeling shared by much of the British public in the days and weeks that followed. The outpouring of grief that followed Diana's death was unprecedented in British history. Over 1 million bouquets were left at the gates of Kensington Palace, creating a carpet of flowers that stretched for hundreds of yards along the palace perimeter. People queued for up to 12 hours to sign books of condolence. Strangers wept openly in the streets. The intensity of the public emotion caught the royal family, the government, and the media entirely off guard. Nothing in British public life had prepared anyone for the scale of what was happening. The funeral was held at Westminster Abbey on September 6, 1997. The congregation included 2,000 invited guests, heads of state, celebrities, and representatives of the charities Diana had supported. Outside, an estimated 3 million people lined the route of the funeral procession. Inside, the mood was a volatile mixture of grief, anger, and barely contained fury directed at the royal family, who many in the public blamed for Diana's unhappiness. Charles Spencer's eulogy was extraordinary. Speaking from the pulpit of Westminster Abbey, with the Queen, Prince Charles, Prince Philip, and the entire royal establishment seated before him, Spencer delivered what amounted to a public indictment of the monarchy's treatment of his sister. He spoke of Diana's vulnerability. He spoke of the pressures that had contributed to her bulimia and self-harm. He spoke of the media's relentless pursuit of her. And then he said something that stunned the congregation. He pledged that the Spencer family would continue to protect William and Harry, not just in the conventional sense, but specifically from the institutional forces that had damaged their mother. The implication was unmistakable. The Spencers were drawing a line. The Windsors had failed Diana. The Spencers would not fail her sons. The applause began outside the Abbey, where the speech was being broadcast on loudspeakers to the crowds along the route. It rolled like thunder through the open doors and into the nave, and then the congregation inside began to applaud as well. It was an extraordinary breach of funeral protocol. Princes William and Harry, seated in the front row, joined the applause. The Queen did not. Diana's coffin was carried from the Abbey and placed in a hearse for the journey from London to Northamptonshire. The route had not been publicly announced, but thousands of people lined the roads, throwing flowers at the vehicle as it passed. By the time the hearse reached the gates of Althorp, it was covered in bouquets. The motorway bridges were lined with people standing in silence. At the estate gates, the coffin was transferred from the hearse to a Land Rover for the final journey through the parkland. The family's flag flew at half-mast from the roof of the house. The household staff lined the drive, and at the edge of the round oval lake, the coffin was carried to a boat and rowed to the island. The burial the following morning was attended only by immediate family. No member of the royal family was present. No cameras were permitted. Diana was laid to rest on the island she had known since childhood, surrounded by water, oak trees, and silence. The decision to bury her there, rather than in the Spencer family vault in the church at Great Brington, was Charles Spencer's, and it was made for practical as well as symbolic reasons. The church was publicly accessible. The island was not. Diana would be safe here. Safe from the cameras that had pursued her to her death. Safe from the curiosity that had never let her rest. The years following Diana's death transformed Althorp from a private family estate into a place of pilgrimage. Spencer opened the house and grounds to visitors each July and August, and created a memorial exhibition in the converted stable block, featuring Diana's wedding dress, childhood photographs, personal letters, and a multimedia presentation that traced her life from Althorp to the Paris Tunnel. The exhibition attracted hundreds of thousands of visitors and generated significant revenue for the Diana, Princess of Wales Memorial Fund, which distributed grants to charities that Diana had supported. But the custodian of Althorp was fighting his own battles. Charles Spencer's first marriage to Victoria Lockwood, a model, ended in divorce in 1997 amid allegations of infidelity. His second marriage to Caroline Freud, a journalist, ended in 2007. His third marriage to Karen Gordon, a Canadian philanthropist, ended in 2024. The pattern of failed marriages echoed the experiences of his parents' generation, and Spencer acknowledged publicly that his childhood at Althorp had left him with emotional damage that he had spent decades trying to understand. In 2024, Spencer published a memoir in which he revealed that he had been sexually abused as a child at Maidwell Hall, his preparatory boarding school. The abuse, perpetrated by a female staff member, had continued over several terms. Spencer described the lasting psychological impact of the abuse and connected it directly to the boarding school system that the British upper classes had used for centuries to educate their children by removing them from their families at the age of 7 or 8. The revelation illuminated something important about the Spencer family's history. The pattern of emotional damage, failed marriages, depression, and personal catastrophe that had recurred through generations was not simply bad luck. It was the product of a system, the system that sent children away from home, the system that taught them to suppress their feelings, the system that valued duty and appearance over emotional honesty. Althorp, for all its beauty, was both the stage on which this system operated and its most visible casualty. Today, Althorp remains a working estate of approximately 13,500 acres, encompassing farmland, woodland, and the 550-acre park that surrounds the house. The house itself contains over 100 rooms, including staterooms decorated with works by Van Dyck, Rubens, Reynolds, and Gainsborough that survived the sales of the 20th century. The Wootton Hall, the central entrance room, features ceiling paintings by Louis Laguerre and is considered one of the finest domestic interiors in England. The library, though much diminished from its 100,000 volume peak, still contains over 10,000 books in rooms whose shelves tell the story of what was lost as clearly as what remains. The estate employs approximately 60 people year-round, and many more during the summer opening season. The farms produce grain and cattle. The woodlands are managed for timber and conservation. The house requires constant maintenance, its 18th century fabric vulnerable to damp, subsidence, and the relentless passage of time. The cost of keeping Althorp standing is estimated at over £1 million per year. But the visitors do not come for the architecture or the paintings or the library. They come because of Diana. They come to stand at the edge of the round oval lake and look across the water to the island where she lies. They cannot reach her. That is the point. The island is a boundary between the public and the private, between the world that consumed her and the peace she was never allowed to find in life. Althorp has survived for over 500 years. It has weathered the Wars of the Roses, the English Civil War, the Agricultural Revolution, death duties, 2 world wars, and the slow erosion of the aristocratic world that created it. 19 generations of Spencers have been born here, lived here, and been carried from here to the church in Great Brington, where their tombs line the walls of the chapel like chapters in a book that never ends. But the book is a tragedy, not in the dramatic Shakespearean sense, where great men are brought low by fatal flaws. In the quieter, more devastating sense of a family that had everything the world considers valuable: wealth, beauty, status, land, and a house that has been called one of the most beautiful in England, and found that none of it was enough to prevent suffering. The baby who died after 10 hours, the mother who left, the wife who was destroyed, the brother who was abused, the paintings that were sold, the library that was emptied, the daughter who was buried on an island because the mainland was never safe enough. The flowers at the gate have long since faded, but the island remains. The water is still, the oak trees stand, and the grass is always kept short.